Welcome to True Crime Case Files, where we unravel some of the most shocking and tragic true stories of crime and betrayal. In this episode, we uncover a disturbing story of violence, betrayal, and brutal revenge. A grandson transmits HIV to his step-grandmother after he brutally beat her, setting off a chain of events that would lead to shocking retribution. Join us as we explore the harrowing details of this unsettling case and what she did later that left everyone reeling. Stephen Bickle's life was marked by struggles that many would find insurmountable. Born into a family plagued by addiction, Stephen had to grow up quickly. His mother, Janice Colton, had been battling alcoholism and substance abuse for years. Her issues eventually led to her arrest for driving under the influence, landing her in prison when Stephen was just 10 years old. With no one else to care for him, Stephen was placed with his step-grandmother, Lori Bickle, and her husband, Dean. Living in their modest home in Milton, Georgia, Stephen faced significant challenges. Lori, a retired high school English teacher, worked hard to maintain appearances of a stable family life. Dean, a once successful businessman, was suffering the early effects of strokes and dementia, leaving Lori to manage most of the household. Stephen's teenage years were tumultuous. Despite Lori's efforts, he struggled in school, often clashing with teachers and skipping classes. By the time he was 15, he had dropped out entirely. Without the structure of school, Stephen became increasingly drawn to the wrong crowd, experimenting with drugs and eventually spiraling into addiction. By 18, he was homeless, spending nights in shelters or on the streets. Local charities, including the Atlanta Mission, sometimes provided him with food and temporary shelter, but Stephen struggled to find stability. In early 2011, Lori convinced Stephen to return home, promising to help him rebuild his life. For a while, things seemed to improve. Stephen began discussing plans to earn his GED and dreamed of becoming a mechanic, inspired by his late father's passion for cars. He even spent weekends tinkering with an old Honda Civic, hoping to restore it someday. However, their relationship took a dark turn that summer. Lori and Stephen's bond grew unnaturally close, eventually becoming sexual. While Stephen rarely spoke about this to others, those close to him noted a significant change in his behavior. He became more withdrawn and prone to sudden outbursts of anger. Tensions at home escalated, with arguments between Stephen and Lori becoming a regular occurrence. Lori confided in a friend that Stephen had started physically abusing her. Neighbors occasionally heard loud fights, with Lori shouting and Stephen storming out of the house. At 19, Stephen was physically imposing, standing over 6 feet tall, and Lori, in her late 60s, was no match for him. Despite this, Stephen's aggression seemed fueled by guilt and confusion rather than pure malice. In the days leading up to his death, Stephen appeared troubled. Friends reported that he seemed agitated and spoke cryptically about needing to get out of that house. Stephen's growing guilt over his actions, coupled with the shame of their relationship, seemed to weigh heavily on him, something that, unfortunately, would end in his murder. It was a crisp fall morning on October 12, 2011, when Milton police received a frantic 911 call from Lori Bickle. The 68-year-old retiree reported that her step-grandson, Stephen Bickle, was unresponsive in his bedroom. She claimed she had gone to check on him after he failed to come down for breakfast, something he rarely skipped. When officers arrived at the Bickle home on a quiet cul-de-sac in the suburban neighborhood, Lori was standing in the driveway, visibly shaken. According to neighbors, she was wearing a housecoat and slippers, her usual polished appearance absent. Officer James Delaney, one of the first responders, described the scene in his report. Lori was crying, but she seemed oddly composed, he wrote. She kept repeating, "I don't understand how this happened." Stephen's body was found in a small bedroom at the back of the house. The space was cluttered with clothes, a disassembled engine from a Honda Civic, and posters of classic cars and rock bands like Led Zeppelin. His twin bed, tucked against the wall, was where officers discovered him. Stephen was lying on his back, pantsless, his face covered with a dry cleaning bag. The edges of the bag were twisted tightly around his neck, suggesting suffocation. His hands and arms showed signs of bruising, likely from a struggle. A strong smell of bleach lingered in the room, and a half-empty bottle of Clorox was found on the floor near the bed. Detectives immediately noted that the bleach seemed out of place, raising suspicions that someone had tried to clean the scene. Lori told officers that she had last seen Stephen the previous evening. He had been in a foul mood and had gone to bed early, slamming his door. She claimed she didn't hear anything unusual during the night. A team of forensic investigators arrived within an hour and began documenting the scene. They collected the plastic bag, swabbed the bleach bottle for fingerprints, and took samples from various surfaces. Meanwhile, neighbors began to gather outside, shocked by the commotion. The Bickles were known as a quiet family, and the news of Stephen's death spread quickly through the community. Stephen's body was transported to the Fulton County Medical Examiner's office for an autopsy, leaving behind a shaken household and a mystery that would soon unravel. When police arrived at the Bickle residence on October 12, 2011, they quickly realized that Stephen Bickle's death wasn't an accident. Forensic investigators, led by Detective Carla Monroe, began carefully analyzing the scene. Monroe, a 15-year veteran of the Milton Police Department, locally famous for her hot body, was known for her sharp instincts and methodical approach. The small, cluttered bedroom was immediately sealed off. Investigators noted the strong smell of bleach and began collecting samples from the floor, walls, and furniture. A plastic dry cleaning bag found twisted around Stephen's neck was removed and sent to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, GBI, crime lab for testing. In addition to evidence collection, forensic experts conducted a routine blood panel as part of Stephen's autopsy. The results reveal a shocking detail. Stephen was HIV positive. Medical records confirmed he had not sought treatment, suggesting he likely hadn't disclosed his status to anyone. The discovery added a troubling layer to the investigation. According to public health campaigns running at the time, HIV was treatable but required honest communication and medical care, steps Stephen hadn't taken. Detectives speculated about how long Stephen, who possibly got HIV from turning tricks on the street, had known about his condition, and whether it had influenced his behavior. Back at the scene, forensic technicians identified bruises on Stephen's arms, wrists, and chest, indicating a violent struggle before his death. A broken lamp on the nightstand suggested a scuffle, and partial fingerprints were found on the bottle of bleach near the bed. Investigators also swabbed the bag for DNA evidence, hoping it would point to a suspect. Detective Monroe's team began piecing together a timeline of the previous evening. Laura Bickle claimed she had no idea why anyone would want to harm him. However, Monroe noted inconsistencies in her statements, particularly about the last time she interacted with Stephen. By the next day, media outlets like the Atlanta Journal-Constitution reported on the mysterious death of the troubled 19-year-old. The article highlighted Stephen's struggles with addiction and homelessness, painting a grim picture of a young man trying to rebuild his life. The revelation of Stephen's HIV status raised new questions. Did anyone in the Bickle household know about it? And if so, could it have been a motive for murder? As the investigation unfolded, attention quickly turned to Lori Bickle, Stephen's 68-year-old step-grandmother. Lori had been Stephen's main caregiver since his mother, Janice Colton, was sent to prison for a DUI when he was just 12 years old. A retired high school English teacher, Lori was well regarded in Milton, Georgia, for her involvement in local charities and her polished demeanor. But behind closed doors, her relationship with Stephen was anything but harmonious. Lori described her role as a caretaker in strained but dutiful terms. She had stepped in to provide a stable home for Stephen, hoping to keep him from falling further into the chaos of his early life. However, Stephen's struggles with addiction and frequent run-ins with the law wore on Lori over the years. At 6 feet tall and over 200 pounds, Stephen towered over the petite Lori. Neighbors often overheard their heated arguments, some escalating to physical confrontations. Lori admitted during questioning that Stephen had become increasingly aggressive, often pushing her or grabbing her during fights. He was impossible to control, she told Detective Carla Monroe. No matter what I did, he would hit me. Initially, Lori presented herself as a concerned grandmother who had simply discovered Stephen's lifeless body. But during hours of interrogation, her carefully maintained facade began to crack. Detectives pressed her on the inconsistencies in her story, especially her account of the events leading up to Stephen's death. When asked about her relationship with Stephen, Lori hesitated. Her response seemed rehearsed, and her body language grew tense. Detectives uncovered that her resentment towards Stephen ran much deeper than simple family frustrations. Over the years, Lori felt increasingly controlled by him. She described the growing tension as overwhelming, pointing to her feelings of helplessness in maintaining her authority in the household and his endless demands. Detective Munro described the moment in her notes. Lori appeared ashamed, but there was an underlying bitterness in her tone. She seemed both resentful of Stephen's dominance over her and burdened by the responsibility she had taken on for his care. This revelation changed the direction of the investigation. Detectives began to question whether Lori's resentment and the power imbalance between her and Stephen could have escalated to violence. Her polished exterior now seemed like a mask hiding years of frustration and guilt. Dean Bickle, Stephen's 79-year-old biological grandfather, was the next focus of the investigation. Once a successful businessman, Dean had become physically frail and mentally impaired after a series of strokes left him with significant memory loss and bouts of confusion. He spent most of his days at home, confined to a recliner in the living room, watching reruns of old westerns on TV or the evening news on CNN. To the outside world, Dean was a distant yet harmless figure in the Bickle household. Neighbors described him as quiet and pleasant, though many noted that Lori seemed to shoulder the lion's share of responsibilities. His health issues had relegated him to the role of a passive observer, leaving Lori to handle Stephen's volatile behavior on her own. During questioning, detectives sought to understand what Dean might have witnessed in the household dynamics leading up to Stephen's death. Surprisingly, they discovered that he was completely unaware of the illicit relationship between Stephen and Lori. Detective Carla Munro, who led the interrogation, described Dean as cooperative but confused. He genuinely seemed shocked when we brought up the affair, she noted in her case file. He said, "That's absurd. Lori would never bleep Stephen. He looked hurt, like he was processing a betrayal he never saw coming." Bean told detectives that he often heard arguments between Stephen and Lori, but he chalked them up to generational misunderstandings or Stephen's well-documented anger issues. "They were always at each other's throats," Dean said during his interview. "But I thought it was just because Stephen didn't respect her rules." When asked whether he noticed anything unusual in Lori's behavior, Dean struggled to provide clear answers. His health challenges, combined with his reliance on others for basic care, left him largely unaware of what was happening under his own roof. Detectives noted that Dean's room was on the opposite side of the house from Stephen's, and his declining mobility likely made it difficult for him to overhear or observe interactions that might have raised suspicion. Dean's obliviousness painted a tragic picture of a man who had lost control of his household. While detectives considered him a suspect initially, they ultimately found no evidence linking him to Stephen's death. His frail condition and genuine surprise during questioning made it clear that Dean was not involved in the crime. However, his ignorance of the affair revealed the extent of the secrecy and dysfunction that had consumed the Bickle household. As the investigation unfolded, detectives uncovered a shocking and tragic twist that shifted their understanding of the events leading to Stephen Bickle's death. The revelation came after forensic testing, including toxicology and blood work, indicated that Stephen had been living with HIV. This information sent investigators back to the Bickle household to dig deeper into the fraught dynamics between Stephen and his step-grandmother, Lori. Detectives revisited Lori's medical history and conducted interviews with her close acquaintances. It was during these inquiries that a grim picture emerged. Lori had recently confided to a friend that she feared she had contracted HIV from Stephen. She had learned about Stephen's diagnosis shortly before his death, a discovery that reportedly left her devastated and furious. The affair, already a dark secret, had spiraled into something far more catastrophic. Adding to this, investigators uncovered evidence suggesting that Stephen had been physically abusive toward Lori in the weeks leading up to his death. Interviews with neighbors revealed that Lori frequently wore long-sleeved clothing and heavy makeup, even in unseasonably warm October weather. When questioned, Lori dismissed these choices as a preference, but one neighbor mentioned seeing bruises on her arms during the casual visit. Detectives also found text messages on Lori's phone from Stephen that hinted at a volatile and controlling relationship. In one particularly chilling exchange, Stephen threatened to expose their affair to the family if Lori didn't give him money. This digital trail corroborated Lori's claims of emotional and physical abuse, but also added a layer of complexity to her potential motives. The twist reframed the investigation, presenting a narrative of a woman pushed to her breaking point. Forensic psychologist Dr. Wendy Kwok, brought in to consult on the case, noted in her report that Lori's situation was a perfect storm of fear, anger, and desperation. The combination of physical abuse, the secret of the affair, and the discovery of Stephen's diagnosis created an environment ripe for tragedy, Kwok wrote. For detectives, this new information didn't absolve Lori, but rather deepened their suspicion. The affair and subsequent violence suggested a toxic relationship that may have escalated into murder. While Lori had portrayed herself as a victim of circumstance, the evidence hinted at a calculated response to a deeply personal betrayal. This twist became a turning point in the investigation, pushing detectives to focus more intently on Lori's potential role in Stephen's death. It also underscored the complex and harrowing dynamics within the Bickle household. Another figure under scrutiny was Janice Colton, Stephen Bickle's mother. Her release from prison just days before Stephen's death raised questions for investigators. At 36 years old, Janice had spent much of her adult life in and out of correctional facilities. Her criminal history stemmed from a long struggle with drug addiction and alcoholism. Arrest records revealed a series of DUIs, theft charges, and possession offenses dating back to her early 20s. Despite multiple stints in rehabilitation programs, Janice often relapsed, leading to repeated encounters with law enforcement. Janice's most recent prison sentence was for a DUI that ended in a minor car accident. She had been released on parole just 5 days before Stephen was found dead. Her return to Milton, Georgia was low-key, but police later learned she had already been in contact with several family members, including Dean Bickle, Stephen's grandfather. As detectives reviewed Janice's movements in the days leading up to the murder, they uncovered a startling revelation. Janice had been carrying on a secret sexual affair with Dean. At 79 years old, Dean's declining health and dementia made the relationship highly unconventional and shocking to the family. Evidence of the affair came from intercepted text messages on Janice's phone and interviews with family friends, who recalled odd behavior between the two at past gatherings, including inappropriate touching. What made this discovery even more significant was Stephen's involvement. Just days before his death, Stephen had learned about the affair. Investigators uncovered a heated argument between Stephen and Janice, witnessed by a neighbor. According to the neighbor, Stephen had confronted his mother, accusing her of betraying the family and taking advantage of Dean's vulnerable state. Witness accounts described Stephen storming out of the house that evening, visibly upset. Police questioned Janice about the affair and its connection to Stephen's death. Initially, she denied the relationship and claimed her visits to the Bickle home were solely to discuss family matters with Dean. However, when confronted with the text messages and corroborating accounts, Janice broke down and admitted to the affair. She maintained, however, that she had no involvement in her son's death, tearfully insisting she would never harm him despite their strained relationship. While Janice's relationship with Dean complicated family dynamics, investigators couldn't find direct evidence linking her to the murder. Still, her presence in the household and her volatile history with Stephen made her a significant person of interest as the case continued to unfold. Laura Bickle's involvement in Stephen Bickle's death was one of the most shocking aspects of the case. Investigators learned that on the night of Stephen's murder, Laura killed him, using a method that was both unexpected and chilling. It was late at night on October 12, 2011, when Lori decided to act. She had been feeling trapped in her toxic relationship with Stephen, overwhelmed by years of physical and emotional abuse, eventually culminating in an HIV diagnosis. She had grown tired of his controlling behavior, his verbal insults, and his constant demands for sex. The stress had built up over time, and after everything she had endured, she finally snapped. According to police reports, Lori used a plastic dry cleaning bag to suffocate Stephen while he slept in his bed. She crept into his room quietly, ensuring that he didn't wake up. As she put the bag over his head, she held it tightly, suffocating him until he was unconscious. Despite his struggles, Stephen could not escape her grasp. Once Stephen was dead, Lori didn't immediately feel relief. Instead, she was filled with a mix of fear, guilt, and disbelief. She had just taken a life, and the weight of what she had done began to sink in. But she knew she had to cover up the crime. Lori went into the kitchen and grabbed a bottle of bleach, using it to clean the room thoroughly, especially around the bed where Stephen had been killed. She wiped down surfaces, hoping to erase any evidence of her crime. At this point, she was emotionally numb, driven by the need to make sure the murder would go unnoticed. The following morning, Lori pretended as though nothing had happened. She acted like she was just another caregiver going about her day, but inside she knew what she had done. The police would later discover that Lori had taken great care in removing all traces of the murder, but she had overlooked one crucial detail: her own DNA. Through later interrogations, police found Lori acting strangely. Her answers during questioning were inconsistent, and investigators noted her nervous behavior. The bleach smell in the room, combined with a lack of a struggle and the obvious signs of suffocation, made the case suspicious. Through forensic testing, detectives discovered Lori's fingerprints on the dry cleaning bag and traces of her hair in the room. Her emotional detachment, combined with the physical evidence, led them to the conclusion that she was the one who had murdered Stephen. When Lori was arrested, she showed no signs of remorse. Instead, she felt a sense of release, freedom from the years of abuse. The shock of being caught was there, but underneath it all, Lori felt that she had finally taken control of her own life. In March 2012, Laura Bickle stood trial for the brutal murder of Stephen Bickle. After weeks of investigation, police had gathered enough evidence to charge her with first-degree murder. The case gained local attention, especially as it involved a twisted mix of family secrets, abuse, and a shocking crime that seemed almost unthinkable. Lori's defense attorney, Richard Casalovo, tried to argue that she had acted in self-defense, claiming that Stephen's history of violence and his affair with her had led her to fear for her own life. Casalovo attempted to paint Lori as a victim who had been pushed to the edge. However, the prosecution, led by District Attorney Linda Barakowski, disputed this claim. They argued that Lori's actions were premeditated and that she had planned Stephen's death in advance, killing him in his sleep, and then trying to cover up the crime. The prosecution presented key evidence, including forensic reports showing that Lori's fingerprints were found on the dry cleaning bag used to suffocate Stephen. They also highlighted the bleach that had been used to clean up the crime scene, suggesting that Lori had gone to great lengths to hide the evidence. In addition, the jury heard testimony about the abusive relationship between Lori and Stephen, with friends and family members describing how Stephen had repeatedly mistreated Lori in the months leading up to his death. In a dramatic moment during the trial, Lori herself took the stand. She told the jury about her troubled past with Stephen and the physical and emotional toll it had taken on her. She admitted to killing him, but claimed she had felt trapped and had no other choice. However, her lack of emotion and the calculated nature of the murder made her story less convincing. After deliberating for several days, the jury reached a verdict. They found Laura Bickle guilty of first-degree murder. The decision was met with mixed reactions. While some felt sympathy for her as a victim of abuse, others were outraged that she had taken a life so brutally. At her sentencing hearing, Judge Thomas Mitchell sentenced Lori to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He stated that while it was clear Lori had suffered in her relationship with Stephen, the murder was a premeditated act of violence. There are no excuses for taking another person's life, Judge Mitchell said. Lori's attorney, Richard Casalovo, expressed disappointment with the verdict, but he respected the court's decision. District Attorney Linda Barakowski, on the other hand, praised the jury for their diligence and the careful consideration they gave the evidence. Laura Bickle was taken into custody to begin her sentence, her future now sealed in a prison cell. After Laura Bickle's conviction in March 2012, her life took a dramatic turn. Sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, Lori was sent to a correctional facility where she would serve out her sentence. Her trial had garnered significant media attention, especially in the small town where she had lived, and her case left many people shocked by the nature of the crime and the complex relationships involved. Behind bars, Lori would spend the rest of her days reflecting on her actions and the lives she had destroyed. Meanwhile, life for Dean and Janice took an unexpected turn. Despite the troubled past they shared, and the bizarre love triangle that had played out before Stephen's death, the two eventually married in 2012. Their relationship had become more public after Stephen's death, with many people in the community gossiping about their unusual bond. Some speculated that Dean's marriage to Janice was an act of redemption, as they tried to rebuild their lives together after the chaos surrounding their son's death. Sadly, their union was short-lived. Just months after they were married, Dean suffered a massive stroke and passed away in early 2013. His sudden death shocked many, as he had appeared to be in good health. Janice was devastated, but her resilience soon became evident as she sought solace in her faith. After Dean's death, Janice began attending church more regularly. She started volunteering at local youth programs and eventually became a youth pastor. Her transformation was remarkable. Once known for her struggles with drugs and alcohol, Janice became a devoted leader, helping troubled teenagers find their way. She took her role seriously, using her past struggles to connect with the young people she worked with, hoping to guide them away from the mistakes she had made in her youth. Though her past remained a topic of hushed conversation in her community, Janice's work as a youth pastor became her new purpose. In the years that followed, she gained a reputation for turning her life around and mentoring others. Her story became one of redemption, showing that even after the darkest times, it was possible to rebuild one's life.